Hey, welcome to the Gateway API community meeting for October 10, 2022. We are getting awfully close to KubeCon. Thanks to everyone who made it here. Just a few things on the agenda today, but before we get to it, just a quick reminder that this is just like any other Kubernetes community meeting, guided by the same code of conduct, which is generally just to be nice to each other. There's a lot more details if you look up the Kubernetes community code of conduct, but I think we've all been very friendly. So another reminder that please, if you have anything to discuss, don't hesitate to bring it up. Anyone should be able to edit this agenda, or you can drop something in chat as well, or just speak up, whatever works best for you. With that, let's get started on the agenda. First up, we've got KubeCon. We're a couple weeks away, so hopefully see some of you there. We had a couple CFPs for Contrib Summit. Both of them got in. One of them is an actual talk of sorts that we need to give. For anyone who hasn't been to Contrib Summit before, it's a pretty informal thing, but I am very much looking for different contributors that may be interested in helping present that. So if you are planning to be at KubeCon, and if you're going to be able to make it to the Contrib Summit on Monday, I'd love to get some new faces in front of the community, especially other Kubernetes contributors. And just, we've got a chance to share our experience working with CRDs with this API. So, if you're able to make it, reach out to myself or Shane, and we'd love to fit you in and have you help out with this talk. Again, it's a pretty informal thing, but would love to get some other people speaking about Gateway API. Just not to put anyone on the spot, but does anyone want to volunteer now? Any chance?
I think Philip Klatt in chat did.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Okay, yeah, Philip.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually that I volunteered to.
Oh, I misunderstood. My bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, well, this is a good intro anyways. Welcome, Philip. Maybe just give a brief intro.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit of, yeah.
So I'm Phil Claudy, and I'm a product manager at F5. And there are a couple of different groups at F5 that are interested in the Gateway API. You guys have probably seen some stuff from our Nginx Ingress team. But I work specifically with in the service provider area, like telco and 5G. And, as you guys, I'm sure, are no doubt aware, all of the service providers are launching 5G on Kubernetes, and it's just starting to happen. And so, I've been working for the last couple of years on a product we call SPK, or Service Proxy for Kubernetes, which is about the sort of ingress and egress, like tying together north and south bound traffic for launching 5G. And I only became aware of the Gateway API a few months ago, but it strikes me that what's going on here is actually kind of vitally important to the work I'm doing. We've already done some demos and things to get our product, where we can use the Gateway API and stuff to show it off. We're getting questions from some large carriers about whether they should be pushing their vendors to comply with Gateway API, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think it's a direction we're very interested in. I have also on the phone Kwong, who's on my team, and you'll probably see some other folks too. But this is something we're really interested in. And I'm actually going to be at KubeCon at the Cloud Native Telco Day on Monday. And I'll be presenting actually about my product and the sort of networking in Kubernetes for 5G. And I'm hoping I can, meet some of you guys there at KubeCon. I don't know what time of day the the stuff you're talking about is on Monday, but I'll be presenting just afternoon, like 1.
Hey, that is awesome. That's a great intro. Welcome everyone from the team. Excited to see where that goes. I've just had a few other people reach out about telco and what that means for Gateway API. So it would be good to make those connections and see where we can go with that. And I imagine I'm not the only person who's had those discussions. So yeah, that's awesome. I know for Contrib Summit, it's basically an all-day thing. The schedule is supposed to be released sometime today, but last I checked, it hadn't been. But we should know soon when these things are going to be. If not, I know I've been trying to set aside time on Tuesday, and I think some other maintainers have some time on Tuesday as well to just have some informal meetings and discussions. So if you happen to have some time on Tuesday free, I know we'd love to meet then too. So yeah, just awesome. Don't hesitate to reach out in Gateway API Slack, and yeah, we'd love to follow up. Yeah, welcome. Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome. And so, yeah, just, yeah, one last reminder, if you are interested in either being part of the working session, hopefully that's many of you. And also if you're interested in helping to present our CRD talk, would love to hear from you. Again, just reach out in Slack or in chat or whatever works best. Nick, it is great to see you alive again. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
I talked to Rob about it, but yeah, for those of you who don't know, yeah, I went on a skiing trip a little while ago and have blown my snapped my ACL and torn my MCL on my left leg and torn my MCL on my right leg. So I am on crutches and immobile and will not be able to make it to KubeCon, which I am extremely upset about. So yeah.
I'm sorry, that sounds quite painful.
Yeah, it's pretty painful, but yeah. Lewin just asked if we can attend the working session remotely through Zoom. I personally would love it if I could at least be a fly on the wall, you know, so that I can, even if I have to get up at some stupid hour, it would be nice to try and, or at least if it's on Zoom and recorded, at least so I can catch up. Yeah, so because yeah, I definitely would have loved to have been there. So yeah, thanks Mike for also for getting started. I can see you getting started on implementing the 1364 stuff as well. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So yes, big +1 to feel better soon, Nick. that sounds awful. But also I should follow up. I've been talking with, I think Jason and Bob are the two people that I've been talking with about Contrib Summit. I'll check in with them to see if there's any like good way to do that. But yeah, I'd love to have some kind of hybrid. So much of the conference is hybrid. I would love to see if we can make that happen for this particular part of it. Yeah, cool. And maybe just reach out on Slack or post a message or something, like if you're one of the people that would be interested in, you know, doing something but aren't able to make it to Contrib Summit or KubeCon in person. We can try and set something up that way too. Yeah. Cool. All right. Next on the agenda, the Ingress to Gateway repo is live, and you are not wrong. There's nothing here. This is just from the template. I still need to make a PR with actual code in here, but the maintainers here are the same maintainers of Gateway API. So I think we'll cover I think this is going to be a pretty small project. But I think we can cover it under the same meetings, the same process, the same everything as Gateway API itself. Yeah, I'll try and get a PR together. You know, for context, this is the thing I presented last week, I want to say, of just a very work in progress tool. You know, it works, but barely. That will take ingress resources from your cluster and output equivalent YAML for Gateway API resources. And it understands some subset of implementation specific annotations. So yeah, that's the thing that I'll try and get a PR out for soon on this repo. But again, for anyone who's a Gateway API maintainer already, you've kind of been volunteered to also maintain this. Thank you. But also, anyone else is welcome to just pay attention and review any changes, contribute. I know the last time I presented this, there were a few people that seemed interested in helping out. So by all means, we can always use more contributors, and this is a great opportunity if you're new and just want to help out. So yeah, that's Ingress to Gateway. It is ready for contribution. Well, I need to make a PR, but then it'll be ready for contributions. Yeah. And then with that, I think let's get into the 060 milestone. And I think, Mike, let's just start with your thing on Get 1364 and what we've got coming up next.
Sure. So yeah, I just broke out 2 PRs and 1 issue that was not addressed explicitly in the GEP, but it is kind of a corollary from things that the GEP suggest should be necessary. So I think that those, so I closed 2 of my older issues. They were kind of like sprawling meta issues. So these 3 should be relatively direct and actionable to get into the 060 milestone.
Great.
So
okay, this is
adding
fantastic.
accepted to gateways. The other one is adding accepted to listeners. And the third one is adding a pending status for a pending reason for all the different conditions for each resource, because setting a reason is required for a condition, even when the status is unknown.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is
Yeah.
this is the one that requires a bit more discussion.
Yes.
This is
All
basically
right.
for the default value we have when its condition state is unknown. You need to have a reason, and so the reason is status unknown, reason pending.
Okay, got it. Okay, I see. I understand now.
Yeah,
Is
where we're currently setting not reconciled for as like in the actual cube builder default for at least gateways, and waiting is kind of a weird similar looking thing.
yeah. So is this pending reason intended to be used exclusively with the unknown state, or are there?
I think so, Mike. What do you think?
I think so. There is some current usage, or it's currently there's a listener condition reason pending that I'm not entirely clear on if it should be used in some other way. I think it's associated with false, but I think that's just more of a documentation issue than like an actual different use case.
Yeah, I think in general, the pending reason seems to fit the best with the unknown one. I don't think you would have it pending as like we're waiting for something to happen. That fits best with the unknown state, not the true or the false state. True or false kind of strongly imply like that any operations associated with the condition have terminated, and so action needs to be taken to change the state. Whereas pending implies we don't know yet, which is the same as unknown.
Got it. So this replaces waiting and not reconciled with pending as kind of one
Yes.
more. Okay.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Just one more place where we're consolidating the different reasons that we had across different conditions to be the same reason across different conditions, across different conditions that are used in different places, like the gateway class condition, the gateway condition, and the route condition. We want them to have similar states and similar reasons, so that when you're looking at one thing, you can transfer your knowledge about one thing to another.
Great. Perfect. That makes sense. Mike or Nick, can you use any help with this? I know there's a lot going on here.
I would be happy for this is relatively straightforward if any new contributor is interested in picking this up. And the other 2, I obviously I have a question that Shane started answering about if there's any specifics as far as like cube builder validation or anything like that for just like deprecating things properly. But those 2 I can probably finish up and ship myself. And there's at least one other one that probably needs a PR around the like HTTP route rules and the changes from the gap, and just making sure those are all clearly documented in our actual docs. That one is much more involved. The gap spells it out well, but the documentation updates are going to be much more involved and comprehensive, I think. So I haven't done that, and I'll probably not have time for that one.
I will have time for that one. That's fine. I can take
Awesome.
that one.
Awesome. Cool. This seems like one of the biggest things we have remaining in, the 060 milestone. And actually, yeah, let me pull that back up. I think a lot of what we have left is in some way tied to status. And, I think we said this is kind of non-blocking. gRPC route is almost done. There's just one more docs PR to get in. And then almost everything is related to status now. So anything we can do to help, and this is not, I'm not trying to rush anyone either. I know that things take time and we don't want to rush a release out the door. But yeah, let us know how we can help. And it sounds like it sounds like all the pieces of the SCEP are accounted for in some way, right? It's Mike, you're doing a chunk of it, and Nick, you've got the rest roughly, except for that one issue that some other contributor could take on. Is that okay?
I think the last thing from the gap is that at some point we have to flip the conformance tests to check for programmed rather than ready. That's the big sort of breaking change. Because we don't actually conformance test for accepted anywhere. The only status that we use in conformance test is ready at the moment.
That was what I found that surprised me, is we don't have accepted anywhere, and if you want to add that potentially, that might not be a bad thing, but it's not breaking at least.
Okay.
Yeah. So we could certainly phase this and have it be that, for 060 we put it that you must set accepted, and we'll check for accepted in the conformance tests, but we'll leave ready as it stands, and then make it that 070 is when we break ready, and we flip that to programmed and move ready to extended. Or we can do it just like it's more. The only reason I would suggest not doing it this time is because just the amount of work that's required to flip all the conformance tests and get it and review it and do all that sort of stuff, and then is a lot. I kind of would prefer to do it all at once, so everyone has to do like one big update to the status calculations. But it's just going to depend on if we can get that in time. So it's just maybe we hold that in our back pocket, and if Mike and I manage to smash the other stuff pretty quickly, and I'm sitting around the week before KubeCon with nothing to do, then maybe I'll try and get it in then, because since I'm not traveling, I can I have a little bit more bandwidth that I'm not going to be like preparing to traveling and stuff. So I can probably push the release buttons just before KubeCon as well, if required. So it could be that we will have enough time. It just depends on bandwidth. But I think the backup plan in my mind is that we go with, I think we definitely want the accepted changes in for 060, definitely. And we should have conformance tests for accepted in 060. And then we hold we wait and see how much time we have to flip the ready behavior over.
Yeah, I think my bias is my preference here is just to go ahead and wait until everything is ready. I think this is a very large change. I like to make sure it's well thought out, and that we have conformance test coverage of everything that we're trying to change. If we don't get this completely released before KubeCon, I feel like that's acceptable. I'd love to have, say, an RC out or something before KubeCon, but if we don't actually have the full thing out, that seems acceptable to me.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So let's to just wrap that statement up then. Ready will be changed to programmed as a part of the 060 release. It may not happen before KubeCon because of timing, but we will make sure that that ready gets changed to programmed with conformance tests updates before we actually cut the final 060. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Is that
Uh,
are there any objections from anybody about that plan? Nope. Okay.
I'll take silence as a good sign, but please, anyone
Yep.
on the call, don't hesitate to speak up if anything sounds even a little bit off. Do let us know.
Yeah. So remember, for everyone who's an implementer, this change is going to be a big one. You will have to stop programming ready, or you can keep programming ready if you want, but you will need to program the programmed condition as well. Like the programmed condition will be what the conformance test used to sort of be as the signal that, hey, now I can actually start checking that your thing is conformant rather than ready.
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks, Nick and Mike, for taking that on. That's a ton of work, but excited to get it through. Yeah, let me run through the rest of the milestone items here. Sorry, Mike, were you about to say something? I may have missed.
Yep.
Right, cool. All right, so this is status. This is gRPC route. I think we're good on that front. Thank you, Richard. I saw one more PR update from you that I need to review, or anyone can review. Richard has done some great work on docs. I think gRPC route is going to be one of our best documented resources as it graduates to beta. So thank you. Then this one is a nice to have. We had a volunteer, but I don't know if that volunteer has made any progress. Yeah, I can follow up. But again, this is something like we've considered non-blocking. More status. Oh, there's a PR for this and I missed it. Sorry. Shane, you've reviewed this PR. Do you remember the state?
This was the one,
Yes.
wasn't it, that didn't have the images as separate tags?
No, it had them as separate tags, or
Yeah.
rather, we wanted a multi-arc build, so it'd be a specific. Yeah, that's where I last left off with it. Was they had put in the PR making separate images for each of the different architectures, and we were looking for a multi-arc build.
Okay. So we probably just need to ping on this PR again. It looks like last activity was a couple weeks ago. Okay. This one I just created, promote reference grant to beta. We've been talking about this for a minute as something that we want in 060, but I don't think we ever had any issue to track it. So I created that. I think this is fair game for anyone who wants to do it. Yeah, anyone that wants to volunteer, just add a comment. And again, love any contributions on this one.
Yeah, so the so this one is update the types and then just check that the reference that we have, that the conformance tests cover everything, right? I think we have pretty good conformance coverage already, but
yes, actually pretty good coverage on reference grant. The weird thing, I didn't really know how to explain this, but John went through a couple weeks ago and did this kind of clever thing where we're using type aliases for everything in Alpha 2. This makes it a bit easier to implement if you're trying to support both Alpha 2 and Beta 1. But it means that the types files are not an exact copy anymore. It's instead you've got to do some type aliasing instead. It should be a much smaller file, but again, type aliasing involved. So that is a little different. Cool. And then the next item up here, more status, and this one from Mike. I think, Mike, you said this one. Yeah, this is just waiting for someone to volunteer. Yeah. Okay.
I'll make an issue for the other route updates, the route rule updates, so that can be in here as well.
Great. All right, so with that, I think if there's nothing else that, oh, no, there's one more thing. Thanks, Candace, and then we'll jump into triage. All right, so 1282 background properties. Maybe Candace, do you want to give a bit of an update on this?
Last week, I made a pull request to include the implementation for what we had been discussing in the meeting for backend properties. The backend properties are the way that we decided to go forward for TLS re-encrypt, also known as upstream encrypt. And I got some feedback from it from a lot of people. Thank you very much for that. And I made some changes, but the one that I'd like to spend just 5-10 minutes on in a face-to-face meeting is what do we call this field? Because I mean, I just want to make sure that it's something that everybody can can understand when they see it. For me, that word was re-encrypt, but I completely understand that that's not a common way of looking at the encryption that happens from the back end, from the gateway to the back end, as opposed to the encryption that happens in terminate, which is from the route to the gateway, or pass through, which is doesn't stop in the middle encryption. So I noticed in our docs, I think there's a link here to our docs. So we use the terms pass through and terminate. And what I was going to suggest was something like forward or extended, rather than re-encrypt, or rather than upstream encryption or anything like that. So as you can see from this diagram, what I'm talking about is labeled as upstream here from the gateway to the service.
Yeah, that's definitely some Envoy terminology creeping in there, because that's how Envoy talks about it. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting naming problem. I'm actually I'd actually be a little bit more inclined, because this thing is already a backend properties thing. It makes sense. It actually makes sense to me what Tara was saying about just calling it TLS, because this is then the TLS properties of the backend, because you're describing the backend, you're describing the service, and so having it be TLS. I think because it's a separate object, it's okay to reuse the word. That's sort of my initial feel. But I think your point is fair, that it is reusing a word, but I think it's only because we've got it as a separate resource, separate object.
We use the word TLS as a listener property, and it's for everything except re-encrypt. So if we use the word TLS for just re-encrypt in this object, are you sure that's not going to? I mean, to me, that's confusing. I'll just say that.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, in my mind, the reason to do it that way is that when you've got the TLS stanza on the listener, it's because the listener has TLS properties, and you're describing the TLS properties of the listener. In this case, the back end has TLS properties, and you're describing the TLS properties of the back end. Right, like you're saying, like, to connect to this service, you need to use these TLS details. And so just having it be TLS kind of makes sense to me. But I understand what you're saying, and I'm not being like, you got to do TLS. It's just like, to me, it makes sense to do that. And it also means that you're sort of reusing a word means that people can kind of expect that the behavior will be similar when you put the TLS properties on the listener and the TLS properties on the back end. It's like, this is the TLS details you use to connect to this thing. I think it would need explanation in the docs, obviously. but because I think all of the things that you're saying, like, I agree that re-encrypt is also not that great, but and other options are then you're sort of saying, like, you're describing the behavior that you're getting rather than a property of the object. If you understand what the distinction there, it's a very subtle distinction, I know, but like you're describing the behavior that you're implementing rather than a property of the object. And so like, does that make sense to anyone, or is that just me talking out my ass?
I'll just
No, go ahead, Rob.
I'll figure out how to unmute myself at some point. Sorry. So yeah, I was actually of the same mind as Nick here, at least initially, and now I'm at least a little unsure. But to me, it seemed like, yes, the most generic way to represent this is just TLS information about your backend. But I do understand that it's going to be confusing if we have a field of TLS property, a struct of TLS properties on Gateway Listener, and a separate set for a backend, and there's zero intersection between what they allow to be configured, which I think would be our initial starting point of and I think as long as we have a path where they converge or where there's some more similarity, maybe that's okay. But I think if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, Candace, I think what you're saying is that at least initially, the concern would be that these would be called the same thing, but be fundamentally different in what they enabled. Is that?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what I'm saying. That's one comment that I had on it. In the end, it doesn't make a big difference to me. We'll just name it what it's named. But if you want feedback on what seems to be understandable, then I just made those suggestions of something that you could put in this document that you're showing on the screen now that would describe to people. I mean, you couldn't put, well, I don't know if you would even describe it in here. You'd have to rework this document for sure, because TLS mode applies only to the listener. That doesn't apply at all to the backend capabilities, which only have one TLS mode.
I remember we had this discussion back in the day when we were talking about different options for TLS mode, and re-encrypt was one of the options we considered. But again, I think at that point in time, the idea was that we really just want to describe what happens at the listener and, on the way in from client to gateway, and then leave gateway to service for some other configuration, such as now backend properties. So I think if we continued with that line of thought, then nothing here would change. We would just add a new section that described how you configure gateway to service TLS.
Yeah, I mean, I think importantly, backend properties doesn't make, one of the good things about having it be separate is that it makes no representations about what the protocol on the listener side is, right? Like, it's completely valid. It seems to me that it should be completely valid to have you come in on clear text and then encrypt to the backend, right? Like, they're completely orthogonal concerns. Whether or not the listener is encrypted and whether or not the connection to the backend from the gateway is encrypted. Would you do that? Like, have clear text HTTP and then HTTPS to the backend? That'd be super weird. But hey, like, but having them be orthogonal concerns means that you don't need to like intertwine the two things. Sorry, I spoke over you. What were you going to say?
I agree. I think that sounds weird that you would only do the second hop encryption. Yeah,
but it really makes sense to me that the concerns are orthogonal, right? Like whether or not the backend encryption happens or not is completely separate decision to whether or not you have encryption at the listener.
Do you mean in terms of
Yep.
who would apply that? Like, do you mean that it's only the application developer who would
Yeah. So
configure the listener, and it would be the cluster admin who would configure the, or vice versa, who would configure the second hop?
yeah. So in my mind, the person who owns the service owns the backend properties for the service. And the person who owns the gateway owns the TLS properties for the listener. So the cluster admin owns the listener, if that cluster admin owns the gateway and the listener, then it's their responsibility what certs are used and how that TLS connection happens. And then as an application developer, I can say, well, I want the connection from your gateway, from the gateway to my backend to be TLS. And that's within my control, and thus the backend properties is mine. And that's another good reason to have the two things be orthogonal, is that it lets you split the decisions about which things are TLS between the personas.
Okay. Can you show the pull request, or I can?
Yeah. Oh, either way. Let me let you be co-host, and then you should be able to share away as well. And that may be easier to highlight any areas you want to.
I think you got to stop sharing, Rob.
Yeah, thanks.
Let me see how do I do this.
And also there have been some good comments in chat here. Can try and go through those soon too.
Yeah, I did make some changes already. There's some I wasn't so sure about, but we don't have to talk about it in the meeting necessarily.
Yeah.
Do you want to? I mean, what I'm talking about now is particularly the use of the word. I use the word re-encrypt to signal this, but let's look at the whole thing actually.
Yeah, somehow we lost a lot of the comments along the way, but that's GitHub. Yeah, I think you changed it to encrypt or
Changed
forward.
it to forward actually, but that, that's what we're discussing now. So this is, I mean, just to remind everybody who hasn't had a chance to look, we'd be using this backend capabilities that has just basically the spec and the status. And the spec itself is what contains the configuration for the re-encrypt section, plus a backend target reference. And then the encrypt type is what has, the information, the specific information that we'd be using for that second hop encryption. So what we're kind of talking about now is, still can't get that tab thing to work there. Gosh darn it. The name to put on this. And if we just substitute TLS there, there are, as I mentioned, there are other places where there is a TLS object, and putting it here, if that works and everybody is okay with it, then I have no problems doing that. It's just going to be me who's confused afterwards if everyone else agrees with it.
I guess the question that I would ask is, does this type here actually need to be different to the one that's on listener? Couldn't we reuse the same type of the one that's on listener here? Because you're configuring the same TLS settings that you do on the listener on the backend?
I don't think so. Go ahead, Rob.
So currently on Gateway, we don't have any kind of like client cert. We don't have a CA bundle that I'm aware of. Which I think would be important here. But I think that could be a cool goal because it does seem like
It would be
maybe
even
if you
more
squint,
confusing. but-
it would be very confusing, yes, but if they could at least start to look similar in their structure.
I guess
Yeah, you're right. Mike is commenting in chat that TLS mode would not be applicable.
Hmm.
That's a good one.
I mean, unless we decided to, it's terminate, pass through, and re-encrypt, but you could only
yeah.
use.
So I just wanted, I just wanted to have asked the question because, like, in my mind, one of the best things that you can do with an API like this is to any time you're talking about TLS settings, have the same or similar keys, because then it's easier. There's less of a conceptual leap for you to understand like what you're talking about. And I think in my mind, that's the reason to sort of have it be like this thing configures your TLS, and you've got like the thing that lets you specify the certificate, like the client, a client certificate that's used and a service certificate that's used. We do have outstanding issues to allow for client certificate for setting like a CA for client certs on the listener. And we do want to do that at some point. And so the fact that we're going to have to do it for the back end, like, says to me, well, hey, looking ahead, we're going to need to do this for the listener at some point. If we name this thing similarly to the listener one and give it some new fields that we then later on backport to listener one and sort of harmonize the things later, then that, in my mind, that makes sense, right? Because the listener has, like, this is the TLS stanza in that case for both of these things configures the TLS details you need to use to connect to this thing, either the listener or the backend. And I mean, if we just like, it describes the TLS properties of the object. And that's what I like about it. Like, describing the properties of the object is what Kubernetes specs are supposed to do.
I think one thing that feels weird to me is, and maybe this is me just not completely understanding, but the idea that you would specify both your client cert and your backend cert in the same place. But and I guess this kind of translates through to gateway to, listener TLS configuration, like you're saying, Nick, of like, can we get to this point where the same set of config works for both? And that, like, same idea for me too. I would love to make that work. I'm just I'm not sure right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't make as much sense in my mind to have the specific client cert that must be used be specified for the listener. Whereas in the back end one, the client cert that you've got there is saying, gateway implementation, please use this specific client cert to connect to this specific backend. Whereas in the listener case, you don't generally want to have a one-to-one pairing like that. You're always having a many-to-one pairing where you're saying, we're going to have some arbitrary number of clients connect to us and they all need to be validated by this CA. For the listener client cert case, you want a CA point, not a client cert point. For this case, you do want having a client cert is a place to supply the client cert that the gateway needs to use to connect to the backend, rather than any other. Yeah.
In the world where there are 10 different gateways that all end up forwarding to the same service, extreme case, but theoretically could happen. It seems like the ideal implementation of that is each one of those is using a different client and that would not be something like representable with this config. It feels like the client cert in that case is actually in the wrong place.
Yeah, true.
So there,
yeah, that's a good point. So you almost want the client cert to be on the HTTP router or configured on the gateway itself, right? Like,
yeah,
or something like that.
It's like the gateway in that case is the client, and it should have its own identity. I don't know. There have been some great comments in chat too. I want to make sure, Mike, Micaiah, Lewin, John, any comments you want to raise out loud? No pressure.
I just have in my mind, it seems like it's more like a transport property between gateway and the backend. I'm just curious, maybe John can comment. How does the ambient solve this? Because you got waypoint connecting to backend. Is that you kind of leverage that like a transport? You got this H-bone transport. Whether there's something similar to that way?
Yeah, so one thing we've talked about in the Gamma group is that things like mesh MTLS, we don't want that to be a part of any API. That's not what this is. Mesh MTLS, or maybe they don't even use MTLS, maybe they use WireGuard or IPsec or whatever, right? That's not what backend properties is. The backend is like what the application actually does. And if the service mesh wants to tunnel over HTTP2 or use WireGuard, whatever, that's up to them. It's kind of orthogonal.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So just, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so what you're saying there, John, is that the backend properties that we're talking about here and the backend capabilities we're talking about these are the certs that if you connect to the port that you're given on this service, it will expect you to connect using TLS using these ports. That's what having this stanza set and this thing implies, is that if you try and connect to a port directly running on this service, then the service like running inside the pod will have these TLS details, right? Like this is not some abstracted thing where the like some implementation is doing some magic stuff for you. This is like this service running inside the pod is actually presenting these TLS certs as part of this thing. And that's why this is a back-end capability. Does that make sense?
Were you talking to me?
I'm kind of asking generally.
Oh.
Like the so I think that's what John is saying is like, for the mesh case, one of the points of mesh is that it's invisible and happens without user intervention, and you don't need to configure anything for it to happen. Like if you're doing the MTLS thing, then that just happens. You don't specify, you don't describe how the MTLS happens at this API level. And so these backend capabilities are describing things that happen like inside the containers that run the service, not at some magic infrastructure layer. And so the point of these backend capabilities is to say, hey, if you connect to this service, you need to have these TLS details set. Or, for example, we put the WebSockets thing in, or if you connect to this service and you have WebSockets available on these paths, or or you should use this load balancing algorithm, or like that's the point of this whole object, is to sort of describe what the service owner wants to have happen for the connecting to this service, not what the service mesh wants to happen. Does that sound about right, John?
Yes, that does. If you don't mind, that kind of transitions to my next question. So it feels like there's almost two different types of things that we want to describe. One is these are properties of the backend, like it is running on TLS, it supports HTTP2 and HTTP1, or all these different things. But then there's another property that is what should I actually send when I'm requesting, sending a request to this backend. If they support HTTP2 and HTTP1, right, I have a choice. I could choose one or the other. If it's TLS, it feels almost obvious, like, oh, well, we should just encrypt it, right? But what if the request is already encrypted? If it's an HTTP route, we probably know. If it's a TCP route, we may not know, right? It could be, opaque TCP stream, but that's actually TLS bytes, and then we don't want to pre-encrypt it. So I don't know what that looks like from an API standpoint, but it does seem like those are actually two different concerns, and we may need to address that in some way.
I think your point is fair, that all of the things that we're talking about are really only useful for HTTP route, right? Like all of the things, not all of the things, but most of the things we're talking about here are really only useful as for HTTP route where you've terminated the connection and now you're creating a new HTTP connection from your gateway implementation. You're not passing through at the TCP level, the stream. You're not doing only TLS route style routing based on SNI. You're doing, this is a unencrypted terminated HTTP stream where you're where now you're trying to describe the properties of that your gateway should use to create a new connection to this HTTP service. Does that make sense? Like Candace, I mean, you're writing this thing. Does that describe in your mind what this means to you?
I thought so. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not intending to make this harder. Like what I'm trying to do here, this is one of my classic exercises of let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Because
but you compared it to something that John had said, which was completely different. Because he was talking about, I think, I mean, not sure I understand what John was talking about either, but I think he was talking about, to who needs to know about this? And that's a question that I had too. Like it's an implementer's question, and I'm not actually coming from an implementer's viewpoint. So, I mean, when you think about it, you're going to have to pull up this backend capabilities at the point where you've got traffic. Excuse me for a second. You've got traffic coming in from the gateway, and you need to figure out whether you need to encrypt it or not, but you need to know whether it's encrypted already.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well.
Here's one implementation I can envision. Let's say, for example, if we're running this in the cloud infrastructure, like say, for example, AWS, we're thinking about maybe just handle this by the cloud infrastructure. So once you come into gateway, the owner of a service decide what kind of certificate you use to authenticate a client. But once you've gone through the gateway, between gateway and backend, it's basically the cloud infrastructure can automatically encrypt everything going from gateway to the endpoint. So that's like one flag, either encryption. So the endpoint doesn't really know because the traffic is already encrypted all the way to the backend part. That's one use case I can think of. So
that sounds a little bit more like what John was talking about with the mesh one, where and that's what I was trying to say before, where it seems to me like this backend capabilities thing almost really should have, like, what the bits that we're talking about here with re-encrypt actually really almost should be under our HTTP stanza, right? Like, so this is a HTTP properties. This is a property of when you're making a HTTP connection to this service only, right? Like, it's not when you're forwarding TCP packets to this service or when you're forwarding an already existing, like an unencrypted, an already encrypted TLS stream. This is only if you're trying to make a HTTP connection to this thing, right? Like, and that's when you then say, okay, the TLS details are required,
right?
Or something like that. Like, so, and again, it comes down to the fact that the backend capabilities here are describing what's running inside the pod. What does the process that's running inside the pod expect you to do? And the process that's running inside the pod expects to receive TLS details, right? And then we're saying that the gateway that's connecting it, everything that we're talking about here is for HTTP route, not TLS route, not TCP route, right? Like when none of this is intended for use with TCP route or TLS route.
Right.
That's at least my understanding.
Yeah, one assumption that is, if you're talking about mutual MTLS, the authentication part, the assumption is the gateway has done the job authenticating who the client are, and also do the authorization to look at the payload to see whether you can do this action. So that's already done by the gateway. There's really no add-on benefit for the backend to do that again. So the assumption is the benefit of mutual TLS between the gateway and the client or transport layer security is just to secure the data. So it's not in the clear text. Because I think assumption is the backend, the pod running application, they just received application data. They already assume the gateway is doing the authentication authorization on behalf of them.
I mean, I think part of the point of this is that we can make it so you don't have to do that, right? Like so that you can do the authorization at the pod level if that's what you want to do. Like I think that's where John's distinction is important, that the MTLS we're talking about here is not the service mesh magic MTLS where it's injected for you by the platform, right? This is TLS where the service owner has generated their own certs and in their pod mounts some certs into their thing and presents the running process with a thing that says, when you are serving HTTP, use these certs. And that, it's not, Does that make sense?
No, I think it does, but I think if I'm understanding Lewin correctly here, she's saying that some cloud providers have a similar switch of just, this is magic, I'm going to encrypt your traffic from gateway to backend.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily just service mesh that has that use case. It could be gateway to backend.
Yeah.
And just, I want it encrypted. And in that case, like, I don't know how to communicate that, but that is a different bit of configuration than what we are exploring here. Or an alternative way to say, hey, I just want it encrypted. Can you do it for me? And
so how do I describe? I think it's very, very clear the way how HBone does it today in Ambient. So basically, when you have gateway and a pod, underlying is already secured, encrypted tunnel between them, or automatic encryption.
Yeah. So in my mind, this like backend properties thing is for people who aren't running, who don't have the infrastructure capability to automatically do encryption. Right?
Right.
This is for people who are running in a cluster. It's only for people who are running in a cluster that doesn't have any of the magic stuff, where you need some way to be able to specify, hey, from my gateway to the back end, I want it to be encrypted, please.
Okay.
yeah, I mean,
It'd be cool
I
if it
think
was
that-
useful in other cases, but that's the main case we're trying to hit is I don't have cool infrastructure available that can help me with this. I'm going to do it all myself. How can I make this work? How can I describe it using the Gateway API?
Yeah, and I agree with that idea, and I do want to do a time check because we are at time here. I just maybe for follow up offline. I think the disconnect here is that what happens when we have gateways that see this backend properties and want to honor it but can't, or like, can we just say some gateways can just ignore it because they don't know how to support it? That would be, I guess, maybe what we need as a follow up. Sorry, Candace, I know that we probably just went in circle. Well, we had lots of good discussion, but I don't know if it helped make this any less confusing. But I think hopefully this served as a good reminder that this PR exists. Please take a look at it. Some good comments in chat and in discussion today. So please let's continue that discussion on this PR. It's 14:30 or in Slack or wherever is easiest for people. But thanks, Candace, for the work on this.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Sorry
Thanks.
to derail the conversation again.
No worries. See you.
Bye.